Hi everyone, welcome to today's video on domestic violence. Before I get into the topic though, I just want to say a big thank you to everyone who has subscribed to the channel, who's been watching my videos and listening to my podcast. I'm truly blown away by all the support, and I hope in the future I'm able to churn out a lot more content than I am at the moment. Thank you so much and I appreciate you all. So today I'm going to talk about domestic violence from a gender symmetry perspective. So what that means is that men and women perpetrate domestic violence at the same rates. This is a pretty controversial topic that I have talked about before with other YouTubers. What I did is I wrote a full report and looked at a range of literature, and that report is available if you're someone that wants to read the full references and backstory to this video, and the link is in the description, which will take you to my website. But let's define domestic violence to start with. So domestic violence can be classed as a systematic pattern of behaviour and abuse, which can be physical, emotional, financial. It can be a range of things, and usually people in domestic violence situations feel very, very unsafe. They feel victimised and they feel like they have no control over their situation. Domestic violence is sometimes called family violence or intimate partner violence. The Australian Bureau of Statistics states that 1 in 5 Australians experience domestic violence. They go on to say that women experience domestic violence at 3 times the rate of men. In the United States, the CDC has reported that 41% of women have experienced domestic violence and 26% of men. However, the difficulty with comparing some of these stats is they're only as good as the data that's collected, and men are less likely to report than women. Additionally, different jurisdictions and different countries define domestic violence differently and record it differently. So it's very hard to compare the true rate of domestic violence in any country and around the world. Domestic violence was not considered an important issue till the 1970s, which is when the feminist movement kind of took off. It was through the feminist movement that domestic violence became an issue that women fought for, an issue where women needed safety. Since then, most of the research and funding has been injected into women's services and feminist services and research on violence against women and children, mainly looking at violence against women. There hasn't been a huge amount of research done on men who are victims of domestic violence, and there's a range of reasons for that, and mainly that's because men feel embarrassed to talk about being a victim of domestic violence and are often not believed by the authorities. As part of the feminist movement, in 1971, Erin Pizzey started the first women's refuge in the UK. She supported a number of women to leave violent situations. But what she found very quickly was that 50% of the women that she supported in those shelters were just as violent as the men that they left. Erin was not a stranger to domestic violence, and she grew up in a home where both her mother and father were quite violent. She's been reported as saying that physical violence came more from her mother. So even before she started a shelter for women, she understood that men and women committed domestic violence and that women can be extremely violent. However, when she voiced her concerns about this and the things that she was seeing, she was of course ostracised and no longer allowed to attend the refuge. This is a common thing that you hear, that if you try and have these conversations, you try to conduct this kind of research that looks at men as victims and women as perpetrators, you're pretty much ostracised, you get death threats, you lose your jobs and you lose your career. Erin is a good example of what happens if you dare to suggest that women perpetrate violence at the same rates as men. While we continue to allow angry feminists to not allow this conversation to happen, we're never going to solve the problem of domestic violence, because much of the research that I looked at actually showed that violence is often perpetrated equally by both men and women, but often instigated by women. And if you're interested in reading the report, you can learn more about that. But let's talk about the 5 key points that came out of looking at the literature around gender symmetry in domestic violence. The first key point I'd like to make is that domestic violence is not a gendered issue, and that men and women commit violence at equal rates, and there is evidence to show that, even if the stats that are collected by governments and agencies are not reporting that. There's decades of research that show that domestic violence is mutual and bidirectional. The late Professor Straus was influential in doing research in the area of gender symmetry and domestic violence. He not only researched in this area, but he also examined other studies that claimed that women were higher levels of victims and men were more likely to be perpetrators. He was quite clever in unravelling some of this research that had misled the reader into believing that women don't commit domestic violence. You only need to look at the media and you'll notice that when they report a woman has committed domestic violence, harmed a child, harmed their partner, that they had some mental health issue or that they were the victim of domestic violence themselves. However, when the tables are turned and it's a man that's committed domestic violence, you'll see the papers say another woman has died at the hands of a man, another woman has been injured. There's never any excuse when a male perpetrates violence. but when women do, we look for answers. It is important to note, however, that Murray Straus, and I also believe this, is that women do suffer more injury than men do. And this is a result of the strength differences between biological gender. Men are physically stronger, so men are more likely to overpower a woman. Even if a woman starts the violence, the man may be the one that ends it. So that's important to note and important to consider. In one study I reviewed, they looked at 32 different nations around the world, looking at whether violence was a man towards a woman towards a man, or whether it was bidirectional. What they found in this extremely large study was that the highest level of violence, the category that ticked the most boxes, was female towards male violence, followed by bidirectional violence, where both parties are responsible for the violence. On the lowest level, it was men committing violence towards women. What many people don't know is men mainly commit violence outside the home rather than inside the home. This study did explore the fact that self-defense may be an issue. However, they found that in most cases, this was quite rare. So why is this the case, and why was Murray Straus so interested in making sure that we knew the truth? Like I said earlier, the domestic violence system is based on feminist ideology from the 1970s, and that has continued over the years. Because it's based in a feminist framework, it's all about protecting women. But through that process, what's happened is we've never looked at things differently, and we continue to do the same things we did years ago. But yet the violence problem has not been resolved. Feminists believe that domestic violence is a result of the patriarchy and the power men have over women. This is a narrative that continues to be talked about today. However, what we're seeing in society is that women, as they move into more positions of power, they hold more power both in society and in the home. Because of this change in power and control, there's a likelihood that the power and control in the home, resulting in domestic violence, may also be changing. However, while we continue to see men as only perpetrators and women as only victims, we limit protection for victims of domestic violence. Point 2. Female perpetration of domestic violence exists, but it's largely ignored. So why are we less likely to recognise females as perpetrators of domestic violence? Men are less likely to report domestic violence. Men over the years have been ridiculed if their wife commits violence against them, whether that's physical or emotional. Men are seen as weak if they don't stand up to their wives, but when they do, they're classed as a perpetrator. This has long been a problem and continues to be a problem today. I get emails every day from men who have been in the system and reported to police about violence towards them. Men who have gone to the police covered in bruises only to find they are charged as a perpetrator. The studies clearly show that this is not about gender, it's about power and control and dominance, and that's what we need to be looking at. When women seek power and control and dominance, whether that's in the home or outside of the home, you change the dynamics, you change the way people respond to each other, and you change the way couples react to each other. This brings us to point 3. Research shows that domestic violence is not about gender, but about power and control. Therefore, we need to be looking at domestic violence differently, not from a gendered perspective, but from a power and control perspective. As I've already mentioned, as women move into more positions of power and become more controlling, I think we're going to see even higher levels of domestic violence from women, if we're not already. Again, it's too hard to tell because of the way the data is collected and the fact that many men do not report when they're in a domestic violence relationship. This is why I'm proposing that we look at domestic violence from a power and control point of view, but that looking at dark personalities such as psychopathy and narcissism can assist us to better understand and identify domestic violence. There's studies that clearly show that these dark personality traits are a huge indicator that someone is going to perpetrate domestic violence. And this is super common. So why aren't we looking at that? Why aren't we looking at power and control and who is using it? Who has the power in the home? If the father is a stay-at-home dad and doesn't earn any income, but the wife earns a 6-figure salary, is she in more control in the home? Because we'd certainly see it that way if it was the woman at home and the man out working. So I think we need to really consider that. And I think it can be a good indicator of whether someone is going to perpetrate domestic violence, understanding what personality traits they have in the dark spectrum that could contribute to them committing domestic violence. The other thing that dark personalities teach us is that women are much more covert in their behaviour and men are much more overt in their behaviour. That's why understanding traits of power and control from a personality perspective can provide a better understanding of how men and women commit domestic violence. This can also remove the stigma of men's reporting. This brings me to point 4. Underreporting by men leads to us not knowing the full picture of domestic violence in the home. Men are scared to report. With such a gendered narrative, I know in Australia it's a huge problem. You know, when we have a domestic violence overarching national plan that's all about protecting women, it's no wonder men are afraid to report. While we continue to use gendered language in our policies and frameworks in Australia, we continue to ignore men as victims of domestic violence. We continue to tell them, don't bother reporting because we won't believe you. If a woman is beating you up, then it's probably your own fault. And that's the message that we're sending to men. This is why men don't report. This is why men don't go to police. And this is why women manipulate men to the point where they're too scared to leave. We often talk about the fact that men hold all the control. But when we look at things like the family court system, it's not the men that are holding the control. It's the man that's removed from the house and the mum is left with the children. It's the man that's denied access to his kids. A woman need only say, I'm too scared or I've experienced domestic violence, and she's automatically believed. Yet a man would need to prove it to actually be seen as a victim. It's this gendered language that's continuing the problem and continuing to cause the problem. Because violence does not happen in isolation. Violence in relationships is about an interaction. It's about conflict resolution in the home. In many cases, it's interactions between two people, and we need to understand those dynamics. I've seen cases where there's been domestic violence in a home. There's been horrible, tumultuous relationships, yet both partners have then repartnered and there's been no issues whatsoever. It could simply be two people that clash. So really, our policies and frameworks need to recognise mutual violence, bidirectional violence, and that violence can happen from men or women. This brings me to point 5. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different response. And I really feel like that's what we've done in the domestic violence space. We've continued to put money into feminist services and research on violence against women, but nothing has changed. We've continued to push men's behaviour change programs, but nothing has changed. I've read some research around the men's behaviour change programs recently out by Our Watch, and if you actually look deeply at that research, what it says is behaviour change programs only work for people that are willing to change. And those people that commit severe violence, violence that can end in death, are never going to change their behaviour. So a behaviour change program is not going to work for them. There's also evidence to suggest that behaviour change programs where there's domestic violence in a relationship works better when both parties attend together so that they can learn to better interact and deal with conflict in the home. Because bidirectional violence and mutual violence is a real problem. So if you're not looking at both people's behaviour and how they respond and react to each other, then the behaviour is never going to change. These days, men are encouraged to talk openly about their feelings and what's going on for them. But when it comes to domestic violence, men are not encouraged to speak up. In fact, they're too scared to. And I don't blame them. I've seen too many stories where men have been classed as perpetrators when they are not. I remember there was a time when we didn't believe women and we didn't trust them and we didn't listen to them. Hence the campaign, #BelieveAllWomen. But through that process, we're believing women more and more without evidence. It's interesting because we don't give men the same courtesy. And it'll be interesting to see in the future whether there comes a time where there's a campaign that talks about the fact that we didn't believe men, we didn't listen to men, and that we lost many men as a result. I know in Australia we talk a lot about women being killed by men, but we never talk about the fact that many women push men to suicide. Women's covert behaviour and manipulation to ruin men's lives, to lie about them, to take their children, leads to them taking their own life, and that's just as bad. True progress in the domestic violence space can only occur when we remove gendered assumptions. The evidence is clear. Domestic violence is equally perpetrated by men and women. And while we continue to ignore this, we cannot solve the problem because we're not looking at the true problem. We're looking through a gendered lens that's not looking at the full picture that could fix the problem. We need to look at shifting power dynamics. We can't solve this problem or identify domestic violence by simply ticking the gender box. Domestic violence is way more complex than that. There's so many things we need to consider, and it can't be decided on a risk assessment form while the police visit for 5 minutes. Unfortunately, my view of domestic violence, where we don't consider gender and only consider the facts and evidence and the behaviours, is not sexy. Politicians prefer to stick to the oppressed and the oppressor narrative because it's easier to remember and it's something people want to hear. It reinforces the perceptions in society, and until we change that narrative, nothing's going to change. Thank you so much for listening today. I know this is a controversial topic. I know this is going to upset some people, and I know that. I'm prepared for that. But if I didn't believe in this so much, why would I risk my career and continue to talk about this issue? I wouldn't. First and foremost, I'm a researcher. and I'm an academic in my heart. However, I know some people out there are going to want to see the evidence. They're going to want to see, hang on a minute, where did she get this from? Hence why I wrote a report before I did this video. If you'd like to see that, the link is in the description and it'll take you to my website where you can download the full report. I have cut it down because it was initially 10,000 words, so it'll be less for you to read. But for those of you who have sat through the whole video, I really appreciate your time and thank you so much for listening. Please be respectful in the comments. I know this kind of thing and this kind of conversation is not for everyone. I know that talking about domestic violence can be awfully upsetting for some people, so please take care of yourself. This channel is all about looking at women who commit bad acts and who display toxic behaviour, but I know that men also do that as well. This is not about hating women and supporting men. This is about supporting victims. This is about making perpetrators accountable regardless of gender. I care about fixing the problem because we have a violence problem in Australia. And in fact, we have a violence problem in this world right now. And it makes me really sad that as human beings, we don't care about each other enough to take a step back and understand other people's points of view. Thank you so much for watching this video. I appreciate your time and I know this is a challenging video to listen to and watch, more challenging for some than others. But I also know that there's many men that follow my channel that will find this very affirming. And I'm going to continue to do work in this space to bring awareness to this issue. And hopefully one day we can start changing the domestic violence narrative so that we can look at the real issue, because that's the only way we're going to fix this problem. So please like and subscribe, make a comment if you like, but be respectful, and I'll see you next time.